Week 17 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So this week, not a great matchup for Jamar Chase and this Bengal team. Most likely, Patrick Surtain is going to be shadowing Chase in this one. But all season long, he's come through with big games. And this week, even if the numbers drop off a little bit, Jamar Chase, he's just the best wide receiver easily in fantasy football this season. And he's won. Number 2, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So it's been a great season for Justin Jefferson. A lot of people were down on him coming into the season with Sam Darnold at quarterback. He had a little drought this season with Jefferson scoring touchdowns, but the last 2 weeks he's come up big for fantasy owners at a crucial time of the season. So this week in a matchup versus the Packers, a team he's obviously very familiar with, and a big ball game for playoff seeding, I think Jefferson goes out there and has a good game, even though this Packer defense has been playing great of late. Number 3, I'm on Ross St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So another monster season for St. Brown with this Lion team and for fantasy owners. Last week he found the end zone once again, and this week a pretty good matchup at the 49ers. Their defense hasn't been good this season. It's definitely had injuries and definitely underperformed. So this week I think St. Brown and this offense, it don't matter who they verse, one of the best, if not the best offense in the league. And him and Jared Goff, they've been locked in for many seasons now. Number 4, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So Collins, I believe we're going to see more work go his way now, is Nico Collins. Obviously, with the injury to Tank Dell, he's out for the season with the torn up knee. Collins might get a few extra targets, even though I think Joe Mixon out of the backfield to get some targets. And also, I think Dalton Schultz as well will working on some targets. But still, Nico Collins, he's had a great season. Once again, him and CJ Stroud have had a good rapport since last year in Stroud's rookie season. And this week in a matchup where they could be chasing points early and often versus Baltimore, he's one of the top receivers. Number 5, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. So Puka Nacua, it's been a solid season for him. I know injuries did him in early in the season, but in my opinion, he's the number 1 wide receiver now on this Ram team, where Cooper Kupp, he just hasn't been performing or putting up numbers of late. So this week in a matchup versus the Cardinal defense that can't stop body and just gave up 36 points to the Panthers, he's a top 5 option. Number 6, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So McLaurin, it's been a great season for him. Him and Jaden Daniels, they're hitting and making big plays. And this week, a great matchup with the Atlanta Falcons coming to town. I know their defense has been okay over the last couple weeks, but those were 2 poor offenses the last 2 games, the Raiders and the New York Giants. So this week, I think Terry goes out there once again, finds the end zone, and possibly gets up to 100 yards. Number 7, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So if it's Kenny Pickett in there for Jalen Hurts, I still believe A.J. Brown could go out there, have a good ball game for this Philadelphia Eagle team. We know he's a great route runner. We know it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. We saw it for many seasons over there in Tennessee. He's still put numbers up. And this week in a good matchup versus a Cowboy defense that he's had great games against in his NFL career, he's still a top option. Number 8, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. So the number 1 wide receiver on this roster easily now is JSN. DK Metcalf, he's been banged up in the last few weeks here, and he finally found the end zone for the first time in 2 months as well as Metcalf last week. So JSN weekly, it's either a touchdown or he's getting over 100 yards. And this week in a great matchup at the Chicago Bears, a secondary that can't stop anyone. He's definitely moved up the rankings towards the end of the season here. Number 9, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week, a little bit of a down game, but this week, a great matchup versus the Carolina Panthers coming to town, a team he's owned throughout his career, being 10 seasons with this Tampa Bay Buc team, playing them twice a year. So Evans, him and Baker locked in, and this week, I think he has a better ball game than last. Number 10, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So last week, a big game for Thomas Jr., 62-yard touchdown. And pretty much he's the only valuable fantasy option on that roster right now with all the injuries to Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Gabe Davis, Trevor Lawrence, to Thomas. He's an athletic wide receiver. He's a coverage problem, and he's only a rookie. Imagine next season with more experience under his belt and with Trevor Lawrence back in their quarterback. So this week in a decent matchup, the Tennessee Titans, I think Thomas could go out there and have a good game. Number 11, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So this week, I know it's a tough matchup at the Philadelphia Eagles. Their secondary's been solid for the majority of the season, even though last week Terry McLaurin and that Commander offense torched them. But CeeDee Lamb, with Cooper Rush in their quarterback, he's still putting up elite numbers and still top 5 in total points at the wide receiver position. So this week, I think Lamb could go out there, still have a good game. I'm not saying he's going to light it up big time in CeeDee Lamb, but more times than not, no matter who the quarterback is, he puts up points. Number 12, Davante Adams of the New York Jets. And now he's the number one option, in my opinion, for this New York Jet team is Davante Adams. Last week he found the end zone once again. Him and Rodgers got the ESP and the rapport back down over the last few weeks here. Adams still could go out there and make plays, even though we know he's in his early 30s where wide receivers start to decline. So this week in a game where they're most likely chasing points at the Buffalo Bills, I think he goes out there and has a good performance. 13, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. Tyreek Hill last week, he could have 3 touchdowns up to in that game. One got tipped a little bit through his hands. Another one he dropped, and then in the second half had a touchdown. So this week, a decent matchup with the Browns. Their secondary really hasn't been that good. We've seen Jamar Chase and Higgins last week go out there and have good games versus this defense. I think Hill and Tua get back on the same page in this ball game, and he goes out there and has a good one. 14, Lab McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. McConkey, the number one wide receiver on this Charger team. He can run all the routes. He's got good hands. Him and Justin Herbert are locked in. And this week in a matchup with New England, give up a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers. I think McConkey goes out there once again and has a good ball game. 15, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So T. Higgins, one of the best number 2 receivers on a team. And him and Chase are the best tandem in the NFL, I believe, at the wide receiver position. So Higgins, he's going to get a big contract in the offseason, I believe, after the franchise tag is up. Him and Joe Burrow have been locked in. And I know he missed some games early in the season, but pretty much every game he's played, and it seems like he's had a touchdown. So this week, I know it's a tougher matchup versus the Denver Broncos, but I still believe Higgins goes out there, has a good game. 16, Cortland Sutton staying in the same game other than the Broncos. So Cortland Sutton, numbers have definitely dropped off over the last few weeks where a lot of teams are double covering and forcing Bo Nix to find a new target to move the football down the field. But this team's still winning games. They're playing well. And this week it's a pretty good matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals where we know all season long their defense hasn't stopped anyone. So I think Sutton goes out there and has a good ball game. 17, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. I know London last week, he got banged up. He had to leave the game early, but he said if he had to come back in since they were blowing out the New York Giants, he would have came back. So him and Michael Penix hit on a couple nice plays. Penix has a nice spiral, could get that football down the field. And Drake London, to be honest, I thought his numbers would have been better this season when Kirk Cousins was in there till week 16. So this week, a good matchup at the Commanders. The secondary really isn't that good. And this has potential to be a high-scoring game. 18, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. And Malik Neighbors, it's been a solid rookie season. And it seems like worst-case scenario, 12 to 15 fantasy points weekly. He's going to get you in PPR league. So he's a freak athlete. And next season, if they get a Shedeur Sanders or a Cam Ward, I think he's really going to drive up the ranking board. But this week, it's either Drew Lock, DeVito, or Tim Boyle in this ball game. And Drew Lock's banged up, so I doubt it's going to be him. But in a decent matchup, at a game most likely where there'll be garbage time, Neighbors could go out there and have a good game. 19, Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears. Keenan Allen's second half of the season, he's bounced back and had some big ball games. In the last 2 weeks, 20 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. So this week a matchup once again versus Seattle where their secondary isn't all that great, but also it could be a game where they're chasing points. And we've seen the Bears the majority of the season in ball games where they got to play catch-up, chase points, and a lot of garbage time. So I think Keenan Allen, he's finally healthy over the last few weeks. He's going out there and he's making plays. 20, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So Flowers, he came out of the gate hot early in the season, but the last few weeks his numbers have dropped off. He's not 100% as well, nursing some injuries as Zay Flowers. But this week's a good matchup at the Houston Texans where their secondary isn't all that good. And this is a Wednesday Christmas game where I definitely could see it being a high-scoring type of game this week. 21, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pickens, he's cleared to go when he's playing after missing a few games with the hamstring injury. And this week, definitely a tough matchup to come back in on Christmas Day versus the Kansas City Chiefs. One of the best defenses in all pro football. But George Pickens, him and Russell Wilson have had a great rapport since Wilson's been the quarterback mid-season. And I think this week, if they want to pull off the upset versus Kansas City, they got to force-feed Pickens a majority of this game. So I think on volume alone, he could be a nice number 2 option in your fantasy lineup. 22, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. I know Kupp's definitely down on my rankings, but the last 2 weeks, non-existent numbers we've seen from Kupp. A goose egg he had in week 15. And then last week, only 5.40 fantasy points in a favorable matchup. It's the New York Jets. So this week, it's a good matchup versus Arizona, a team he's had a lot of success against in his NFL career. But like I said, Cooper Kupp, the ceiling really hasn't been high for him in many weeks, with Puka Nacua taking over as the number 1 wide receiver. 23, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, it's been a good season for him. Obviously, last year was better with Justin Fields at quarterback. And Keenan Allen, the last couple weeks, he's been operating and performing as the number one wide receiver for the Chicago Bear team. So this week in a matchup where it could be high scoring or the Bears will be chasing points once again, I still think DJ Moore, worst case, could get 12, 15 fantasy points in PPR leagues. 24, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So Garrett Wilson, his numbers are dropped off with Davante Adams traded there 2 months ago to the New York Jets. This week, a middle of the pack matchup at the Buffalo Bills. But Garrett Wilson, we know he's a good wide receiver. Once again, he's closing in on 1,000 yards. And we've seen it with bad quarterbacks go out there and put up numbers. We saw with Zach Wilson last season. This year, targets are down a little bit, like I said, the last couple weeks. But this week, I still think he's a solid number 2 wide receiver for fantasy owners. 25, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So Addison, the second half of the season, he's going out there putting up points. Finally healthy. He was injured at the beginning of the year. And him and Justin Jefferson, one of the better combos in the league. So this week in a matchup versus Green Bay, where I expect a lot of scoring between these division rivals, I think Addison goes out there and has a good game. 26, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith, it's been an up and down season for him. I know Kenny Pickett might have to start in this ball game for the Philadelphia Eagles, but Devonta Smith last week still went out there and put up some decent points. And this week it's a good matchup versus a team he's had good success against in his career in the Cowboys. 27, Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. This week a good matchup at Tampa Bay. Their defense has had trouble stopping wide receivers all season long with injuries in the secondary and just bad coverage. And Thielen easily the number 1 wide receiver for this Carolina Panther team. So this week I think he could go out there once again and he could hit that 12, 15-point fantasy mark. Worst case, 28, Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. So his numbers have dropped off a little bit over the last few weeks. Here's Juwan Jennings, still a good wide receiver, breakout season it's been for him with Brock Purdy and Jennings obviously having rapport going back to playing with the second team a few seasons ago. So this week in a matchup versus the Lions where they could be chasing points early and often, I think he's a solid back-end 2 flex option. 29, Jameson Williams staying in the same game of the Detroit Lions. So last week a big 70-plus yard touchdown for Jameson Williams. But he's doing more than just being a deep ball threat. He could run those intermediate routes, and then if you get him in space, that's where it really comes in, the speed, the yard after catch ability. So this week in a matchup at San Francisco where we could see high scoring, and San Francisco's secondary hasn't been that good this season, I like Williams as a good option. 30, Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. And Calvin Ridley, it's been a decent season for him in his first year in Tennessee. And to be honest, there's not much going on with this Tennessee Titan team. Him and Tony Pollard, the only 2 bright spots on this offense. So this week, a good matchup at his former team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. Their defense, their team in general is all banged up, and their defense is giving up a lot of points. I think Ridley is a flex option, is a decent option this week. 31, Jacoby Myers of the Vegas Raiders. So Myers last week, he had a down game, and even a couple weeks ago, a down game as well. But I know Desmond Ridder was in there in Week 15 at quarterback versus the Atlanta Falcons. This week, a good matchup in New Orleans. Their defense is depleted. Their offense can't move the ball, which tires the defense out where they run the field more. And this week, I think Myers could go out there and have a bounce-back game. 32, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. So Reed, I know, number 1 wide receiver for this Packer team, but they mix up a lot of formations. They play with 4 wide receivers at times moving around the field. Reed, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Dontayvion Wicks. And this week, it is a decent matchup indoors at Minnesota, which is always a plus this late in the season. But like I said, Reed, his ceiling's pretty much been 11, 12 fantasy points in PPR league, and he's more than a number 3 flex option. 33, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. So Metcalf, it's been a struggle for him over the last 2 months. I know last week he found the end zone, but besides that, it would have been another mediocre to poor game for Metcalf. So this week it is a good matchup at the Chicago Bears, a defense that can't stop anyone. But like I said, with Metcalf, he's been tough to trust, and yes, he is playing injured, well, you got to give him credit there. But JSN's taken over as the number 1 wide receiver. 34, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. So last week, this passing game was a total down and dud game, but you don't see 2 weeks in a row with Josh Allen in this passing game. Can't get anything going. So I think Shakir and this Bill offense could go out there, have a good game. This Jet defense hasn't stopped anyone all season long, and I think Shakir bounces back. 35, Josh Downs and the Indianapolis Colts. So this week, a great matchup at the New York Giants, a defense that can't stop anyone. Downs operating as the number 1 wide receiver. Michael Pittman's been a non-factor all season long. And Anthony Richardson, I'll give him this. At least he targets Downs. And last week we saw him break a big touchdown And the 36th and final wide receiver I'm ranking is Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Bucks. So right now, he's the number 2 option in the passing game. Jalen McMillan, even when Kate Otten was there before he missed last week's game, McMillan was going out there making plays. And the rookie's finally breaking out in the last few games of the year with 4 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. So this week with a good matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. And we know Baker Mayfield's a gunslinger, and they're most likely going to be double teaming Mike Evans at time. McMillan's making the most of the one-on-one coverage, getting open and making plays. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for championship week or week 17 of the fantasy football season.